At the end of the last segment, we introduced a distinction between epistemic possibility and necessity on the one hand, and metaphysical possibility and necessity on the other. Roughly, you can think of something as epistemically possible if it's thinkable, if you can coherently think of it before you've sort of looked at the world. You've acquired your language and your concepts, but you haven't yet checked how they apply to things in the world. So if you can think of it, it's epistemically possible. If you can't, it's not. So once you've acquired the concept sister, for example, you can't think of a sister who isn't a sibling. Whereas once you've acquired the concept sister, you can think of a sister who, say, is tall or a sister who's short. So it's epistemically possible for a sister to be tall. It's epistemically possible for a sister to be short, but it's not epistemically possible for a sister to fail to be a sibling. Metaphysical possibility, as we said, tracks how things could or could not have been given how they actually are. Now, here's a way of thinking about necessity and possibility. We can think of necessity and possibility in terms of possible worlds. And here we have each circle representing a possible world, an entire universe. On traditional ways of thinking about modal space, we can assess modal claims without knowing which world is ours. After all, says tradition, modal claims are true in all possible worlds, so why would it matter which world you're in? So take the claim that bachelors are unmarried. Suppose I'm in the purple world. Well, bachelors are unmarried is going to be true in all possible worlds if I'm in the purple world. Now suppose I'm in, say, the green world. Bachelors are unmarried is going to be true in all possible worlds if I'm in the green world. And this is going to extend to each of the worlds. It doesn't matter which one I'm in. Bachelors are unmarried is going to be true in all of them because bachelors are unmarried is necessarily true. So that's the idea when we say we don't need to know which world we're in to know which modal truths hold, modal truths hold. We're saying since the modal truths are the same no matter which world you're in, it doesn't matter which world you're in. You can identify the modal truths. You can think of it in contrast to contingent truths, like truths about the actual world. For example, take the claim that bachelors are messy. Well, there may be a possible world where it's true that all bachelors are messy. And there may be another possible world where it's false that all bachelors are messy. So suppose in the red world, all bachelors are messy, and in the orange world, some bachelors are neat. Then the statement bachelors are messy will be true if you're in the red world and false if you're in the orange world. So you need to know which world you're in to know whether that statement is true or it's false. In contrast to a claim like it's possible that bachelors are messy, that's now a modal claim because we've added the possible that. It's possible that bachelors are messy. That's going to be true if you're in the red world, made true by your very own world, but it's still going to be true if you're in the orange world because it's made true by the red world. That is, in the orange world, it's not true that all bachelors are messy, but it's still true that it's possible. Why? Because it's true in one of the worlds in your space, in the red one. So the idea goes, you don't need to know which world you're in to know the truth value of any given modal claim. Okay, so on this way of thinking, possible worlds and ways things might be, so possible worlds and what we might call scenarios, different versions of our actual world, different ways of thinking about our actual world collapse. They're the same thing. And correspondingly, metaphysical possibility, ways things are in some possible world, and epistemic possibility, ways things could be in the actual world, collapse. They amount to the same thing. So this distinction between metaphysical and epistemic possibility, that is what's could have been the case or what is the case in some possible world on the one hand, and what could be the case or what ways the actual world could be for all we can know a priori on the other hand, that distinction collapses. Consider an example, and now in relation to the claim, in the relation between water and H2O. Now here we have a bunch of different possible worlds, a bunch of different ways things might be. In one of them, water is composed of a chemical structure XYZ. In another, it's composed of X3Y2, and so on and so forth. In one of them, water is just an element. It can't be decomposed, and so on. And these are ways things might be, I should say, not possible worlds. That is, these are epistemic possibilities. So you're thinking of this like, the way I want you to think of the circles right now is they're representing discoveries that we could make in this actual world. So we think we're in the world represented by the green circle, where water is composed of H2O, but you can imagine that we're wrong. You could imagine that we announce tomorrow, oh, our current chemical theory was wrong. It should be replaced by this new one. And in this new one, water is actually XYZ, as in the red circle or the purple circle. Or you can even imagine us discovering that it turns out that we can't decompose water at all. The decompositions that we thought worked were all illusory and the theory was bad, so water is an element. So these are ways things might actually be, discoveries we could make. Put another way, these are all epistemic possibilities. It follows on the traditional view that there is a possible world where each of these is true. That is, each of these circles represents a possible world, not just a way things might be, not just an epistemic possibility, but a genuine possible world, a metaphysical possibility. So it follows that water could have been XYZ, and thus water isn't necessarily H2O. Now, this should be sending up a red flag for you already. Kripke can't possibly accept this because he thinks water is necessarily H2O. So he's going to have to distinguish between ways things might be and ways things could have been, between epistemic possibilities and metaphysical possibilities. So now we can get to Kripke's theory of modal space. On this theory, ways things might be is distinct from ways things could have been. Epistemic possibility is distinct from metaphysical possibility. So you can think of Kripke as showing this. Sometimes we need to know how things actually are before we can assess what is necessary. Put another way, there isn't a possible world for every way things might be, epistemically speaking. Not every way things might be is a way they could have been, given that they aren't actually that way. Not every epistemic possibility is a metaphysical possibility. So even though we could discover tomorrow that water is XYZ, there may be no possible world in which water is XYZ. Now, notice that this is just a direct consequence of Kripke's idea that the essence of things sometimes isn't captured by anything like a sense. The essence of things instead is a scientific discovery. It's something that you learn by investigating how the thing is, so you can be a competent user of water without being able to identify its essence. Water being XYZ may be epistemically possible, but not metaphysically possible. So here we have some ways things might be. We might call these scenarios. That's what David Chalmers calls them. And on the other side of the screen, we're going to have some possible worlds. That is, some worlds where things are a certain way. And let's suppose that in the actual world, the stuff we've been calling water is composed of XYZ. So XYZ fills the lakes and the oceans and so on and so forth. Well, given that, says Kripke, water is XYZ. Now you might wonder why we care about the underlying chemical structure. The answer to that was given in a previous video when we talked about why we care about the DNA sequence for tigers, but I'll give a quick recap. Water, using Putnam's terms, has a hidden structure. That is, there's something that isn't superficially visible, isn't required to be known for competence with the expression. That is, you don't need to know the hidden structure, the underlying structure, to be competent with the expression water. And nonetheless, that hidden structure, that underlying structure, is the essence of water. Why is it the essence? Because it's what various samples that we've called water share, which also explains the superficial behavior. So when we point at two samples, and one is a bit muddy and one is clear, and we say both are water, why do we call both water despite the fact that they look different? It's because we presume that they share some underlying structure, and that underlying structure is responsible for important macroscopic behavior, like it's responsible for both, if purified, samples being clear. It's responsible for the way the water flows. It's responsible for the freezing point and the boiling point and so on and so forth. That is, we suppose that there's some underlying structure that's responsible for all of those macroscopic properties. And that's why we care about the underlying structure. So when we say water is XYZ, what we're saying is that having chemical structure XYZ is what produces all of the superficial properties by which we ordinarily recognize samples of water as water. So we're supposing that water is XYZ in this world, in the actual world. Now there's a question. what is water in other possible worlds? Well, trivially, there is a way things might be in which water is XYZ, since we're supposing that water is XYZ. So the actual world is indicating that there is a way things might be in which water is XYZ. And there is a way things could have been in which water is XYZ. After all, the actual world is one way things could have been. So the possible world represented by the red circle in the right-hand side, that's a genuine possible world in which water is XYZ. But what about the remaining worlds? Is the green possible world over here on the right-hand side a world where water is H2O? Kripke wants to say no. Kripke's going to say any world in which XYZ fills the lakes and oceans and so on and so forth is a world where water fills the lakes and oceans and so on and so forth. That is, water is XYZ in all possible worlds. Why? Because when we introduced the term water, we were trying to talk about the hidden structure shared by the samples that we were calling water, where the hidden structure is that which is common across the samples and explains the superficial properties by which we ordinarily recognize water as water. Since we were trying to talk about that hidden structure, when we use the term water, we're only referring to that which shares the hidden structure. What shares the hidden structure? It's in these possible worlds, just the XYZ in in red and purple. Given the semantics of water, thinks Kripke, since water is actually XYZ, it is necessarily XYZ. In every possible world, we're talking about whatever shares the hidden structure had by actual samples of water. So, worlds in which something else plays the watery role, acts like our water acts, aren't worlds in which that stuff is water. Given all this, thinks Kripke, we know certain conditionals. We know if water is actually XYZ, then there's a possible world where water is XYZ, and there's no possible world where water is something other than XYZ. So we know that water is necessarily XYZ. That is, we know this conditional. If actual samples of stuff that we've been calling water are samples of XYZ, and XYZ is the hidden structure of that stuff, then necessarily water is XYZ. We know that conditional. We don't know that water is necessarily XYZ a priori, because we need to discover empirically what the hidden structure is, but we know a priori the conditional that if the hidden structure is XYZ, then water is necessarily XYZ. Okay, notice the mere coherence of XYZ filling the lakes and oceans shows that things might be that way for all we can know a priori. So there is a way things might be where water is XYZ, and a way things might be where water is H2O, and a way things might be where water is an element, and so on and so forth. Since these are coherent, they're thinkable. A 5-year-old could imagine discovering them, and a 5-year-old is perfectly competent with the word water. But whether there is a possible world where water is XYZ, and whether there is a possible world where water is H2O, an element, or whatever, is conditional on what the actual world is like. Conditional on what the actual hidden structure of the stuff we've been calling water is. So, although there is a way things might be where water is XYZ and a way things might be where water is H2O, there isn't a possible world for each. Not both of these are metaphysically possible. So there isn't a possible world for every way things might actually be. Given that H2O actually fills the lakes and oceans and so on and so forth, there is a possible world where water is H2O, but no possible world where water is XYZ. But notice that given that H2O actually fills the lakes and oceans and so on and so forth, there's still a way things might be, because we could be wrong, where XYZ fills the lakes and oceans and so on and so forth. So we get two spaces of possibility. The epistemic space, way things might be for all we know a priori, or way things we might discover things to be, however unlikely. And I want you to notice this is genuinely epistemic. This is about what we can know a priori. And then there's the metaphysical space of possibility, ways things could have been given how they are, ways other possible worlds are. You can think of the second kind of space as capturing essence and accident, as capturing the sort of nature of things, the fundamental reality of things. Whereas the first kind of possibility just captures how we think. It captures the conceptual role of our terms. So we get two ways of evaluating one space of possibility. We can think of this as two ways of evaluating one space of possibility. When we evaluate ways things might be without first considering what the actual world is like, we're investigating the epistemic. When we evaluate ways things might be only after discovering the nature of the actual world and while keeping that nature in mind, we are investigating the metaphysical. Since each of these is a coherent, that is, each of the circles represented here, each is a way things might be for all we can know a priori, so each is an epistemic possibility. But once we discover which is actual, once we close off of other epistemic possibilities by hypothesis, that is, we say we're going to suppose that, say, the purple one is actual, then we get to possible worlds. And if this purple one is the actual world, then water is necessarily XYZ. So in any world where where XYZ fills the lakes and oceans, water fills the lakes and oceans. And in any world where something else fills the lakes and oceans, water doesn't fill the lakes and oceans. So let's suppose instead that the green world is actual. And I think that's the way things actually are. Water fills the lakes and oceans in the actual world. Now, water doesn't fill the lakes and oceans in any world where XYZ does. But water does in any world where H2O is. Notice that on this way of thinking, we don't need two spaces of worlds. Instead, we need one space of epistemic possibilities and two ways of evaluating it. We can evaluate it before we make a supposition about which world is actual, in which case we can say that water being XYZ or water being H2O are both possible, meaning epistemically possible. Or we can evaluate the space after we've supposed that we've discovered which world is actual, in which case water being H2O is possible, but water being XYZ isn't, because we've made the discovery that water is actually H2O. Okay, and we will stop that segment there. You might want to listen through that a few times. If you find it particularly interesting, I can send you some articles that go into more detail on this.